They say that brevity is the soul of wit, and I say, less cleverly, that wit is the soul of comedy. Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb, doesn't seem like a comedy at first glance, aside from a few one-off lines and scenes. But underneath is a subtext about the anger and denial that comes from impotence, humorously brought to its logical conclusion. A man initiates a nuclear strike on Russia because he can't accept that it's his age that's causing him sexual impotence. So he blames the Russians through a crackpot conspiracy theory about their fluoridation of American water. A crippled doctor who changes his name to Strangelove loses the impotence of his legs and can hardly control the springing erection of his arm when he begins discussing a male's fantasy of repopulation. A group of men in the Pentagon's war room learn to accept the deaths of every living thing on Earth because Dr. Strangelove proposes a future in which each man is assigned 10 attractive women to repopulate the Earth with while riding out the radiation in mine shafts. And when one realizes that the Russians could do the same, he instantly goes on the defensive, warning the president of a mineshaft gap.
We must not allow a mineshaft gap!
In the beginning of the movie, the song Try a Little Tenderness plays as we watch one plane refueling another. A visual metaphor. I don't have to tell you what the refueling pipe looks like. We see a base commander on the phone to his lower officer, and there's a great shot pointing upwards towards the commander's head, with a large cigar being viciously chewed as he smokes it. I've heard large cigars like this called penis extensions before, and I believe this is what Kubrick was going for in this shot. After all, it's this man's insecurity that dooms the entire world. And I think even if Kubrick wasn't intending anything so specific, it's a great way of expressing the man's struggle with insecurity visually, as he's introduced. He explains to his lower officer that he's ordered Wing Attack Plan R, a contingency plan to launch nukes at Russia should the president die and the chain of command be broken. Next, we meet the bomber squad who would eventually survive to drop the nuke that set off the Russian Doomsday device. The pilot's first seen reading a Playboy magazine, and when he notices that Wing Attack Plan R has been ordered, he starts talking with his mouth full over the radio, informing the rest of the crew. We're taken to a bedroom with a woman lying in her underwear in a centerfold pose similar to what we see on the pilot's magazine. She answers the phone and is told about Wing Attack Plan R and a huge breach of security, and is made to get the president's military advisor out of the bathroom and onto the phone. As he's on the phone discussing the drastic, world-ending event, he contemplates grabbing the girl's ass. He's told to go to the war room as soon as possible, but makes time for one last kiss, even making a goodbye joke referencing a nuclear launch.
You just start your countdown, and old Bucky will be back here before you can say, blast off!
In the war room, the advisor's on the defensive about the contingency plan, telling the president that he shouldn't write off the whole program just because of one mishap. He goes on to suggest that America launch a full-fledged nuclear strike once it's determined that ordering the bombers back is going to be tricky, arguing that they could catch the Russians off guard, suffering only acceptable casualties on their homeland.
Prevail and suffer only modest and acceptable civilian casualties from the remaining force, which would be badly damaged and uncoordinated.
The president, understandably, doesn't like this idea, and instead opts to let the Russian ambassador in to explain the situation, and tries to get the base commander's recall code by force. The way I see it, the movie is Kubrick comparing the Cold War to a dick measuring contest. The subtitle, How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb, refers to Kubrick learning to see the mutually assured destruction as a big joke, with the insecurity of both sides being the butt of the joke. Throughout the movie, we learn more about the Mad Base Commander's motivations as he explains them to his first officer. When the officer first meets him, the commander asks for a drink of grain alcohol and rainwater. As he explains later, this is because he believes the Russians are fluoridating America's water in an effort to turn us all docile. When asked how he first realized this, he says it was during sex. He was with a woman when he felt, as he puts it, a sense of fatigue. He doesn't outright say erectile dysfunction because he can't accept that it's a natural part of his aging. He goes so far in his efforts to redirect the blame off of himself that he blames the Russian conspiracy, saying that fluoride in America's drinking water is sapping his vital essence.
Do you realize that fluoridation is the most monstrously conceived and dangerous communist plot we have ever had to face?
In his delusion, he states that women can sense his power. He doesn't avoid women, but he denies them his essence. So in his mind, the next logical step is to turn the Cold War hot. After the reveal of the base commander's insecure delusion, the cat's out of the bag as far as the comedic nature and themes of the movie go, though that doesn't mean that Kubrick's done exploring the joke. Back in the war room, the president phones Premier Kizov in order to tell him what's happened and to point out where the bombers are so his Air Force can take them out before they strike. The premier is drunk, and it's hinted at that he was with a woman when the president called.
You would never have found him through his office, Mr. President. Our premier is a man of the people, but he is also a man, if you follow my meaning.
The two of them argue like an old married couple, and after the premier is inaudibly screaming on the phone, we hear the president say,
"Well, listen, how do you think I feel about it?"
The way I see, this is a parallel to the situation with the base commander, albeit to a lesser extreme. When the president learns that he's impotent to stop the nuclear strike, he instantly goes on the defensive, trying to make excuses for his failing rather than focus on resolving the situation, just as the base commander makes excuses for his sexual impotence. The premier asks to speak to the ambassador and explains to him, who then explains to us and the Americans, that any nuclear strike on Russian land will trigger the completely autonomous Doomsday Machine, which will bomb the entire world. When asked if that's even possible, Dr. Strangelove, one of the Nazi scientists America picked up after World War II, explains that it is, but that the entire point of such a machine is lost if it's kept a secret.
Is that the whole point of the Doomsday Machine is lost? If you keep it a secret, why didn't you tell the world, eh?
The ambassador replies that it was meant to be unveiled at the next UN meeting. A real perfect storm of Armageddon, where the human element of America's fail-safe deterrence failed, and where the machine element of Russia's fail-safe deterrence failed. Earlier, on the Mad Base Commander's base, he told his men that the Russians could come disguised as American soldiers, and so they fight off the group trying to capture the base commander until his soldiers eventually surrender. When this happens, the base commander tells his first officer that he's afraid he'll give in when they torture him for the bomber's recall code. He says that when he's in heaven, he'll be able to answer for what he's done, and goes to the bathroom to kill himself.
I'll try and guess what the code is.
Back on the bomber plane we met earlier, they're being tracked by a missile sent by the Russian Air Force, and are able to deflect it far enough away that only their code receiver and fuel lines failed. They won't be able to receive any orders from America, and they'll have to hit a closer target of their choosing, rather than their assigned primary or secondary target. The first officer desperately tries to decode a sheet of paper the base commander was scrawling on, writing "purity of essence" and "peace on earth" over and over, and eventually realizes the recall code must be P-O-N-E. The colonel that retook the base tries to find the first officer to arrest him, but the officer convinces him that he thinks he knows the recall code. He's allowed to get a phone call out to the Pentagon to tell the president the recall code, and by this point the Russian Air Force has taken out a handful of the bombers, not yet realizing that the bomber we met wasn't destroyed. They issue the recall code to the bombers, and other than the one we've met, whose receiver was destroyed, they all turn back and cancel the strike. The bomber crew that's left realize they won't be able to make it to a landing zone, and go over the inventory of their emergency survival kits, which includes, among other things, a prophylactic, and, while this is off topic, one of my favorite props in any movie.
1 miniature combination Russian phrase book and Bible.
Just as the men in the war room are celebrating, the premier explains over the phone that his Air Force has one less confirmed kill than they originally thought. The president points out the targets that the bomber was intended to go for to the premier, and tells him to put all his air defense at those locations. Dr. Strangelove explains a method of repopulation involving using mine shafts as fallout shelters and living in a sex-crazed society for the next 100 years. And suddenly, all of the men in the war room, the president included, completely forget about the impending death of all life on Earth and perk up their ears to the idea of 10 women to every man. Sure enough, the bomber drops its payload at a different location than the Air Force is defending, and the entire world turns to ash. But not before one of the bomber pilots straddles the bomb and rides it down to Earth, swinging his hat and yee-hawing like a cowboy in a cheap porno movie. Before the Doomsday device activates, we cut back to the war room where Strangelove is still explaining his repopulation method. As he's doing this, his bum hand forces itself into a Nazi salute over and over, as he tries to keep his excitement contained. When he can't do it anymore, he stands up, and realizing what he's done, proclaims,
Monsieur! It can work!
Thanks to the visuals, particularly one shot, angled so that we can't see Strangelove's arm, only his face as he looks down and tries to keep it from shooting up again, it seems pretty clear that the doctor's arm represents his arousal at the thought of repopulation. An arousal so strong he manages to stand up for one last time. This is where the second meaning of the title comes in. Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. Dr. Strangelove is how everyone in the war room, the ambassador included, learned how to stop worrying and love the bomb. Sure, the last tiny remnants of mankind will be forced to live in mine shafts for over 100 years, but hey, 10 attractive women to every man.
I hasten to add that since each man will be required to do prodigious service along these lines, the women will have to be selected for their sexual characteristics, which will have to be of a highly stimulating nature.
I must confess, you have an astonishingly good idea there, Doctor.
During the end sequence, we see a series of mushroom clouds set to Vera Lynn's We'll Meet Again, a song about optimism before going to war and returning home to your lover. I think the main purpose of the choice is to further the idea of being optimistic about war and a way of saying that nuclear holocaust is inevitable, a message similar to the key phrase of the Fallout franchise, war never changes. Just as America bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki, even if we make it out of the Cold War without exchanging bombs, there's always going to be another war waiting just around the corner.